Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Henning. I am professor of philosophy and environmental studies here at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where I have the pleasure of serving as the founder and director of our Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. It's my great pleasure to be able to host this event with you today. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral homelands of the Spokane tribal people. It was those members of the indigenous communities in our areas that invited us to this region originally. We're very thankful to have them here in our community as in the stewards since time immemorial of the land on which we sit. Before we get started with today's program, I wanted to bring to your attention that we also are hosting several more events this semester in our climate lecture series. On March 9th, we're really pleased to have with us Cardinal Michael Cherney to speak on caring for our common home. And then on the 20th, Kevin Kuntz will be talking about building resilient infrastructure. First talk in April with Dr. Griffin Thompson on the political and ethical dimensions of the renewable energy transition. And then our last talk of the semester will be on April 13th with some of our climate resilience team from the Climate Center discussing addressing extreme heat in Spokane. Hosting events like this, as you can imagine, does take considerable resources. And so if you have any resources that you are able to share in order to try and help us to live into our mission to better understand and respond to the climate crisis, we would be very thankful for that help. And now I'd like to introduce actually my colleague, Dr. Joshua Schultz, who is an associate professor of engineering here at Gonzaga University and a member of our faculty advisory board for the Climate Center. He's a licensed professional engineer and technical director of Mass Timber. So Dr. Schultz, please join us.
All right. Hey, thank you, Brian. So I'd like to take this moment to introduce our speaker today. Paul Kingsnorth is an Oxford-educated husband, father, and writer who lives in the west of Ireland. His nonfiction, like Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, explore topics like environmentalism, globalization, and the contrarieties of journeying through this human life. He's also an acclaimed novelist and poet. You might know him best for his Buckmaster trilogy. Paul also has a website and a fortnightly Substack, The Abbey of Misrule. At various points in his life, he has been an environmental activist, a Wiccan, a Buddhist, and in January of 2021, he was baptized into the Romanian Orthodox Church. One of the threads in his life and his writings is his appreciation for living in an enchanted world, or as he says, with a faith that was not a dusty moral template, but a mystical path, an ancient and rooted thing, pointing to a world in which the divine was not absent, but everywhere present, moving in the mountains and the waters. In this vein, and since this is the start of Lent in the Western Church, and since it never hurts to start with a poem, I thought I'd end my introduction with a stanza from T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday. If the lost word is lost, if the spent word is spent, if the unheard unspoken word is unspoken unheard, still the unspoken word, the word unheard, the word without a word, the word within, the world and for the world, and the light shone in the darkness, and against the world, the unstilled world, still world, about the center of the silent word. So with that, I'd like to introduce Paul Kingsnorth. Paul, on behalf of Gonzaga, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time with us here today. Paul, you can go ahead and unmute. And there we go.
Thank you, Joshua. Sorry about that. I had internet jamming up a bit there, but I hope you can hear me. I'm coming to you from rural Ireland where broadband is not excellent, so I hope you'll forgive me if it goes up and down. Thank you for the poem. Thank you for the introduction. It's an appropriate poem. It's actually the beginning of Lent in the Eastern Orthodox Church on Monday as well, so I think for once the two calendars align. So what I'm going to talk about now is not really climate change, and it's not really environmental technology or anything like that. I'm going to talk about stories and the stories we tell and where the stories we tell take us. And I'm particularly going to talk about the Christian story and my surprise discovery that it may have something to tell us actually about where we are and how we got here. Maybe even how to live in the times we find ourselves in, which are times that I've been writing about all of my life as a writer. For at least 25 years now, I've been writing about the natural world and our relationship with it, and the technological society we've built, and the problems that brings us. Now, I was 50 years old just a few months ago. So I was born in 1972. And 1972 is also a good year for a jumping off conversation about environmentalism, because 1972 is, I think, the year that Greenpeace came into being. It's the year that so many green parties and publications came into being. The early 70s and the late 60s are really the birth of the green movement. So in that 50 years, which is a relatively short time, historically speaking, obviously, quite a lot of things have happened. Here are a few of the things that have happened. So firstly, the gains. So in that time, in that 50 years, we have over 3 billion more people on Earth, including me and all of you, 300 million more cars, twice as much petroleum-based fertilizer, 3 billion extra tons of oil consumption per year, 70% more climate-altering gases in the atmosphere, 70% more energy use worldwide than we used when I was born, 2 billion more people living in the world's cities, 400 billion barrels worth of known oil reserves used up in that time. We have now a planet's urban population bigger than the rural population for the first time in history. So those are a few gains, just a few things that have happened in the last 50 years. Here are a few losses over the same time period. Between a quarter and a third of all the world's wildlife, including 25% of all the land-based species, 28% of the marine species, 29% of the freshwater species, 35% of the mangrove swamps, 20% of the corals, over a quarter of all the Arctic wildlife, 600,000 square kilometers of Amazon forest. Humanity currently consumes 25% more of the world's natural products, as we like to call them, than the Earth can replace. And that figure is predicted to rise to 80% by the middle of the century, which is just another 25 years. So that's a lot of numbers, and I expect you've heard a lot of this before, or a lot of this kind of thing before. It can be very depressing to hear it. And after a while, we can just, I think, turn off from it, because numbers are very difficult to relate to. Percentages are very difficult to get our head around in terms of our actual relationship to the natural world and to each other. But there are a lot of numbers, and they keep on coming. By 2040, for example, there will be 9 billion humans on Earth. Only 7% of the Earth's surface is unaffected by human activity. And for the economists amongst you, I'm certainly not one of them, but apparently at an average global economic growth rate of 3%, this is a great figure, we will consume in the next 20 years as many resources as we have consumed since humanity first evolved. How about that? So we are in a really very unprecedented place and time. All of this has happened in my lifetime and yours. And as I say, beyond a certain point, it's very difficult to just take this in its numbers. And the more this story is told in numbers, the less it looks like a story. But it is a story. It's a story of how we're living and what we're doing. It's not a story of using the wrong fuels. It's not a story of having the wrong politicians. It's not a story of having the wrong ideology. It's the story of the direction of our culture, at least since the Industrial Revolution, history, in other words, which is a story. But of course, we can tell different versions of this story. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, will tell one version of it, and Joe Biden will tell quite a different one. And broadly, the story that our culture in the West has been telling since the Enlightenment, since the Industrial Revolution, since the Renaissance perhaps, has been the story of progress. And we know this story because we're all brought up on it. And it tells us that science and reason and technology and liberalism and capitalism and maybe socialism and communism as well, depending on who's in power, will lead us ever upwards to a promised land in which we live longer and healthier and happier lives. Now, I haven't ever believed that story. I don't know why, I just haven't. Partly because I could look around me and not really see it coming true, but also because it seemed to me that that story was missing a huge amount of what you could actually tell was going on in the world. There was a lot missing from the story, a lot that wasn't being told. And looking at the reality of the kind of numbers I've just given you, and looking at the reality of that world as I saw it anyway, when I was a young man, when I was a student back in the Ice Age, made me into an environmental activist. There weren't quite so many of us around back then in the 90s, but I engaged in a lot of direct action. I wrote for a lot of green magazines and set up campaign groups and worked for other campaign groups. And I did a lot of that kind of thing for a long time. I wanted to protect the natural world and a lot of human culture as well from what I saw as the depredations of this thing called progress. And all the while I was looking for an alternative story to tell, because if you don't believe in the story your society is telling you, you look around for another one. You think, okay, well, something's wrong with this story. What story should I be telling instead? What does the truth look like? What story can I tell that makes me feel I'm saying something that has more of a connection to reality as I see it? Now, environmentalism can be quite a desperate thing in that sense. It can be quite hard work being an activist. You lose a lot more than you win. And it requires you quite often to hope for things which are not likely ever to happen. So once I hoped that politics would rescue us, that agreements or treaties or great leaders or the correct ideology would sort things out, or technology or science or public pressure or movements, that kind of thing. Or I hoped that everybody would wake up and agree with me, or that the wealthy would give up some of their stuff and the rest of us would do the things we needed to do. And after a while, I found that I couldn't really believe that anymore, because it wasn't happening at any scale, and it still isn't. These days, I tend to look on our culture as a giant machine that we live in. I see it as a kind of engine with its own momentum that's been driving for a long time. And I see all of us moving within it with our own desires and stories. And now that I look back, I'm able to see that some of the things I believed back then when I was looking for another story, when I was wanting another story, weren't true either. And I think one of the things particularly that I believed, because again, we were brought up to believe this, was that humans are broadly rational creatures. This is very much the Enlightenment story. And it's how we'd like to think of ourselves. When presented with evidence, we'd like to think that we'd act accordingly. But that isn't really what happens. In reality, we can rationalize anything away. If we don't want to hear it, we won't hear it, and we'll find a reason not to. Climate change is an excellent example of this. The scientific consensus, we keep hearing about this, tells us that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by, I think, between 60 and 80% in order to stabilize the climate. Just to stabilize it, that isn't going to prevent it warming up very much. And we have to do that within 2 or 3 decades at most. And we have to do that in the context of a global industrial economy that's growing at the fastest rate in human history, that's globalized to an unprecedented extent, human population and a rate of human population growth that we've never seen before either. And the vast majority of the world's nations put economic growth at the heart of their reason for being, and that economic growth is entirely dependent on fossil fuels, and the emissions from those fuels are still going up after 30 years of climate change discussions. There's no other fuel source that we know of that can provide anything like the power of fossil fuels, and certainly not anything like the cheap availability of them either. So we don't have very long, supposedly, to do the thing that we need to do, and we have growing numbers of people who think that climate change isn't even real, because they don't want to hear that story, because that story is a threat to them. And so they're telling themselves it isn't real, and they can find plenty of studies to back themselves up if they want to do that. So this brings us to a bigger problem, and this is an existential problem. As I said, this is part of the story of progress, but it's the bit that gets left out. The civilization we've grown up in was built on a bubble of oil, which is now draining away. It's running out. And even before it runs out, we have to stop using it because it's destroying the atmosphere. Everything that we know has been built on that bubble, and not just the material stuff, but also the bigger things like cosmopolitanism, global travel, the welfare state, arguably things like liberalism, democracy, holidays, entertainment, the internet. All of this is built on fossil fuels, and there's no other fuel source that is cheap, easy, available, or anything like as powerful. We wouldn't have been able to do anything that we've done really at anything like the level we've done it without the fossil fuels and the industrial age. And that's where we find ourselves. And the story of progress that was built on the back of that huge debt of fossil fuel that we sucked out of the ground and burned has enabled us to do things we could never have dreamed of doing before. But now we can see the price of them. And when I was a young activist and I got to the point of realizing that we weren't going to be able to turn this around, we weren't going to stop burning this stuff, we're not stopping, and it didn't matter what we said, we didn't seem to be going in the right direction. That brought me to a crisis point, because the story I'd been telling myself as an alternative story to that of progress was that activism could save the world, and if we told enough people about what the problem was, then they would do something about it. Neither of those things seemed to be true. Now, being a writer, I tend to see the world in terms of stories. All writers do, but all of us do. As I said, we're driven by the stories about how the world is. All of us, whatever our politics are, our beliefs, our attitudes, we've picked up a story from somewhere, and we're telling ourselves a story about what the world is. And as I say, the story of progress, this is the kind of meta story of our age. It unites the left and the right, the young and the old. And what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that we're going to be masters of the world. It tells us that we're separate from the world as well. There's a thing out there called nature, and we've got to treat that thing well, or maybe not. Maybe if we want to, we can just chop it all down and burn it. But either way, it's a separate thing from us. We're masters of it. We have the ability or even the right to control it. And through science and through technology, we will eventually come to an understanding of how it all works, so that we can manipulate it for our own benefit and for its benefit too, of course. And we have to do this because this is what benefits humanity. If we don't do it, there'll be poverty and misery. So related to this story is the story of inevitable material progress. This is one that I grew up with. I don't think people do now, but I did. Every generation is supposed to experience better material conditions than the one before it. And this up escalator will eventually remove all poverty and misery from the earth. That's connected to economic growth, which is the central cause of every nation state, the unquestioned desire of all politicians. More growth, more growth, more growth is the solution to everything. Ultimately, this is a story about transcending limits. It's a story about humanity, modern Western humanity mainly, but nowadays many other cultures as well. And that if we all work hard enough, we use the science, we use the technology, we can be gods. We can run this place. We can do what we want to do. This is our founding myth. Every civilization, every culture has a founding myth from which it draws a sense of purpose, and this one's ours. And I think that much of the stress and breakdown and confusion that we're currently seeing across much of the West, much of the cultural division, is because the story isn't working anymore. It's failing us. It doesn't feel true. I suspect it feels a lot less true to younger people than to older ones. It's not delivering. It's not actually happening. And so we're finding ourselves in a kind of runaway story. We're trapped inside the story of progress. Increasingly, it's difficult to believe it, but we don't really have a better one. And we've got a lot of evidence of the potential nastiness of the crash that the story is going to take us into. There was a study that came out a few years ago, I remember seeing it, funded by NASA, which warned of the possibility of civilizational collapse this coming century as a result of many of the factors I've talked about here. Now, certainly back in 1972, only a few wackos, or people regarded as wackos, were talking about civilizational collapse. Even when I was an activist, it was very uncommon. Now it's on the front page of the New York Times, and NASA are sponsoring it. Everyone seems to be telling this story now. There's a lot of anxiety around, a lot of apocalyptic fear. So here's the question. If the story is wrong, if the story of progress is wrong, and maybe if some of the stories of activism that I used to believe are wrong as well, what does a better story look like? Because all of the stories I'm talking about here are really stories about the necessity of human power and our desire to break limits and bust them. Now, it's a common question to hear now. Again, you often hear this. What's the new story? What story could we tell instead? And sometimes we can assume that we have to write one. We have to sit down and create a new story, us clever people in the West or whoever or wherever we are, as if we could do that, as if some person or group of people could sit down, come up with a better way of seeing the world and then pass it on and everyone would agree. Now, I used to say this myself. It's another thing I used to believe. I used to say, we need new stories. We need new stories. Back in 2009, I founded an organization called the Dark Mountain Project, which is still going. I'm not involved in it anymore, but it's still out there. And it was an international network of writers and artists. We produced books, we ran festivals, and we launched a little manifesto to get the whole thing going. And we called it Uncivilization. And it was a challenge to the myth of progress. And it was a challenge to artists and writers, especially because Dark Mountain is an artistic movement, a literary movement. And what we said to these artists and writers was, if you don't believe that this story is working, how would you write? How would you create? If you're a creator, What would you do if you actually believed that this story was taking us to this disaster that progress appears to be taking us to? How would you write your novel? How would you write your song? How would you paint your painting? You can't paint and write as if it was still 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, if this is true. And part of that manifesto that we wrote was this call for new stories. But as we went on, and as I met storytellers, and as I met Indigenous people, and as I started to dig into religious traditions far more, started to realize that it wasn't new stories that we needed. What we needed was to rediscover old stories that had worked. Because although what is happening to us now is in one way very unprecedented, we've never had anything like this before at this scale. In another sense, it isn't anything new. Civilizations have risen and fallen many times before. The world is covered in ruins as a result of that. It happens. Humans rise and humans fall, and they crash and they collapse, and their models don't work and their stories break. So there are probably some things out there that can tell us how to see through this thing that appears to be part of the eternal human condition. Now, the early green thinkers, the early environmentalists who I was inspired by, the people like E.F. Schumacher and Leopold Kohr and Rachel Carson and Vandana Shiva, these kinds of people, and they themselves were inspired by earlier thinkers like Tolstoy or Gandhi. They had all taught us that the ecological crisis was a crisis of limits, or rather a lack of limits. As I said, progress is really the story of transcending limits, of humans breaking all the boundaries and doing exactly what we want and need to do, taking the world in our hands and gripping it. Modern economies thrive by encouraging ever-increasing consumption of junk, and our culture encourages us to fulfill any happiness or desire we want, and that creates this material crisis, a crisis of limits. But then if you dig into that further, you see that the crisis of limits is then a crisis of culture. The culture is doing something wrong. It's telling you that this transcendence of limits is okay and that no limits should be respected. And then you follow that further and you realize, or I did anyway, that a crisis of culture is actually a crisis of spirit. And what I mean by that is that every living culture in history, certainly every one that I've ever heard of, from the smallest tribe to the largest civilization, has been built around a spiritual story, spiritual core, something that is bigger than us, something that we see as higher, more transcendent, more divine than us, from where we get our ultimate truth. Every culture has this. They may see it differently, they may define it differently, but they all have it. And every culture that lasts, I suspect, understands that living within limits set by natural law and cultural tradition, ecological boundaries, is a spiritual imperative. And spiritual stories always talk about limits, what limits humans should live within and the consequences of trying to break them. Now, there only seems to be one culture in history, as far as I know, that has not had a spiritual story that it is cored around, not had a spiritual story which tells it about the danger of busting through limits and the necessity of living a life that is focused not on the human self, but on something higher. And that's our culture, the one we're living in, the one that's changing the climate, the one that's creating an extinction event, the one that's hitting the buffers, the one that believes in the story of progress, which itself, when you look at it like this, can start to look like our version of a religious story. Now, I was going through all of this over many years, having been an activist and now having been somebody who started a movement that thought that activism wasn't working, and I was always feeling my way forward for these stories and thinking, well, what's the conclusion here? And I started to see dimly that something I should have seen years ago, which is that the religions, the great spiritual traditions of the world, all the saints and the gurus and the mystics and all the vessels built to hold these people, the vessels that we call religions, they might have been there for a reason. Again, the modern story, the Enlightenment story, tells us that we've thrown off silly superstitions like religion. We don't need it anymore. We've got science. And so we can rationalize our way to the future. But it turns out that religion does something useful. It does a lot of useful things, actually. But one of the things it does is it tells us something very urgent about human nature and what happens when our reach exceeds our grasp. Now, Karl Marx famously said that religion was the opium of the people. The English writer G.K. Chesterton replied to him and opposed him on this. And he said, no, it's irreligion, lack of religion, that's the opium of the people. He said, wherever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they will worship the world. But above all, they'll worship the strongest thing in the world. And I think that's what we do. We worship the strongest thing in the world, which is the economy, which is money, which is wealth. The story of progress is the story of worshipping the strongest thing in the world, instead of worshipping God or gods, whatever you happen to see and understand the spiritual center to be. And I started to see, after many years of struggling with this, because I didn't really want to see it. I didn't really want to see it as a liberal, secular, atheisty sort of person, that in its outline, progress was actually a religious story. We hadn't abandoned religion, we just created a new one. And so I went looking for alternatives to it. And as Joshua mentioned there in the introduction, I spent about 10 years on quite an explicit spiritual quest, alongside the writing I was doing, and my work with Dark Mountain, and even some activism which was still going on, trying to find out what the story is, what the story could be, what the spiritual story, if you like, was. I became a Buddhist. I practiced Zen Buddhism for a long time. I learned a lot from that. I was exploring various pagan traditions. I became a Wiccan for a brief amount of time. Spent a lot of time studying mythology and working with mythologists, going on retreats and wilderness fasts. And then in the end, much to my surprise and initial shock and resistance, I found a story which seemed to tell me what was going on today. And I found it in the last place I wanted to look. So let me read to you the introductory paragraphs of this story. God formed man out of dust from the ground, and he breathed in his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God took the man he formed, and he put him in the garden to tend and keep it. And the Lord God commanded Adam, saying, you may eat food from every tree in the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you may not eat. For in whatever day you eat from it, you shall die by death. Now the serpent was more cunning than all the wild animals the Lord God made on the earth. And the serpent said to the woman, you shall not die by death. For God knows in the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. So she took its fruit and ate. And then to Adam God said, cursed is the ground in your labors. In toil you shall eat from it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return from the ground from which you were taken. So that's the book of Genesis, the beginning of the book of Genesis, a sort of truncated version. And it's the story of creation. Now, I'd never thought to look for a new story in the book of Genesis, I can tell you, but this story fascinated me, and it still does. I keep going back to this, because this story tells us, this creation myth tells us something very eternal about where we are now. So consider the story. The original creation is a garden, and in this garden, everything is in communion with everything else. Every creature is in communion with every other creature, and all of them, including the humans, can see God walking around in the garden in the cool of the evening, it says in the book, which I think is a lovely image. We're so close to the divine, we can see him walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. No animal is eating any other animal. Everyone's a vegan in the Garden of Eden. It's plant-based food all the way down. Because the original communion has humanity and nature entwined. And humanity in the book of Genesis is the last thing created, which is something that the book of Genesis has in common with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. They both tell us that humans are one of the youngest species. And interestingly, when God creates the universe, when he creates the stars, when he creates the waters, when he creates the animals, at the end of every day in the book of Genesis, obviously there are 7 days of creation, we hear that God saw that it was good, but not on the day that he created people. He didn't see that they were good. Interestingly, people were flawed, or rather, people were not yet mature. So we're put in the garden to tend and keep it. We're God's apprentices. And that's our work, to learn to tend and keep the earth, to steward it, to have dominion over it. Dominion in that context, in that translation, doesn't mean domination, destruction. It means care. We're supposed to be gardeners, created to be gardeners, God's apprentice gardeners. That's who we are. But of course, we're tempted. We have one thing we're not supposed to do, and it's eat this fruit. learn about the knowledge of good and evil because we're not ready yet. We're not mature enough yet. We haven't got the wisdom, and knowledge without wisdom is very dangerous. But we're tempted by the creature who is opposed to God, by the adversary within us and without us, and we eat the apple. And when we've eaten the apple, we have the knowledge. We don't have the wisdom, but we have the knowledge, and the knowledge is separation. And we're separated from God, we're separated from nature, and the whole of creation is sickened by this. The apprentice has broken the thing he was given to look after, and that's the fall. We fall away. So back when I was a green activist, as I said, it would never have occurred to me that the Christian story might have something to teach us. I believe that the Christian story taught us to dominate and subdue the earth, and it was part of the problem. That's a very common story. But as I say, when I started to look further, I saw something else. You see this story that begins at the beginning of the book of Genesis, and then it goes all the way through the rest of the whole Bible. And it goes from the book of Acts all the way to us now. It's told every day, and it's the story of our rebellion against God. We're in rebellion against creation and creator. Originally, we're in communion, we're in harmony, and our desire for knowledge, power, and control breaks the harmony. And pride and desire lead us to fall into this place. We have to leave the garden and we have to be laborers. So we come down onto the earth, and now suddenly everything's eating everything else, and we have to break the soil. And the women have to give birth in pain, and the men have to labor in the fields. But back here on earth, the rebellion continues, and we fall further from God. In the garden, as I say, we were apprentices to God. We were carefree, but now we're sickened by our own ambition, and so is everything else. So what do we do now? Well, we've got two choices. And these are also eternal choices that we make every day. We can try to go home, back to the garden, back to the source, the creative source of the universe. And what the coming of Christ is supposed to do in the New Testament is give us a way back home. Christ is the second Adam, and we can choose to follow him. So what is this way back home? Well, it's humility, isn't it? Blessed are the meek, says Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, what does humility mean? It's an interesting word. It's got the same etymology as the word humus, which is soil, the matter in the soil. Humility is the way of nature, it's the way of the soil. Interestingly also, Adama is a Hebrew word for clay. The word name Adam is a bit of a pun. Adam is made of clay. How does God make humans? In the book of Genesis, he takes clay, takes humus from the soil, and he breathes into it. All humans are soil plus the breath of God. I love that image. So Adam is formed from the soil. He breaks away from the soil with his rebellion, and he falls into the self. And then along comes the second Adam, that's Christ, invites us to walk again in the way of humility, the way of the soil, repentance, which means turning around. Turn around, walk this way if you want to go back home. The alternative to that, the alternative to the way of nature, to the way of the soil, to the way of humility, is the way of the serpent, which is the way to try to become gods ourselves, which is what we did when we started to eat the apple, and what we're still doing today, and what has changed the climate, and what has caused the extinction. What does the path look like? You start to see that in the Genesis 4. Cain, we meet Cain, son of Adam, first murderer, also the builder of the first civilization. Cain is the first tiller of the soil. He's the first farmer, first one to bend nature to his needs on any scale. Cain builds the first city, and his descendant, his grandson, I think, Tubal-Cain, is the first smith. He's the first metal worker, creates the first weapons. So Cain, the one who has murdered his brother, the one who has rejected God, he is the father of technological civilization. Rejection of creation, rejection of our duty to love and keep our fellows and to tend the garden, that leads us into all of that darkness. It leads us into the desire to be like gods. You can either walk towards God and seek union with God again, or you can try to beat God at his own game. Those seem to be the two stories that were given all the way through the Bible. And we always want to beat God at his own game, but we keep failing. But here we are, here's Cain and his descendants. They want to be like gods. How can you be like gods? Well, what do gods do? Gods create. How can we create? With technology. So the fire of technology, the fire of Tubal-Cain the smith, raises us above the rest of creation and gives us the power to destroy it. And it blinds us. and it whispers to us like the serpent. And instead of returning home in humility and repentance like the prodigal son, we walk out deeper into the rebellion. We try to build the world ourselves. We try to replace nature with a better version. This is what manifests today in the age that we're in, the age of transhumanism and artificial intelligence. That's where this machine society is taking us. Now I've talked about some of the obvious consequences of the war on creation that we're waging and with our supposedly scientific mindset. But there are less obvious consequences, and we're seeing them now rushing very, very fast towards us with the rapid advance of digital technologies, which are really allowing us to fulfill our very, very old Cain-like desire to become as gods, the first promise we were made in the garden. We've got something happening now in the digital age, which is really very unlike anything that's happened before. There's a very good book called What Technology Wants by a man called Kevin Kelly, which I'm always talking about. Kevin Kelly is a Silicon Valley guru. He's a major voice and a major thinker in Silicon Valley, major developer there as well. Kelly believes we are creating something or allowing something to create itself with the technology we build. And he calls it the technium. And he says we've been creating it for a long time. And with digital technology, we're coming to the point where it's starting to manifest. So here's a quote from his book. After 10,000 years of slow evolution and 200 years of incredible exfoliation, the technium is maturing into its own thing. Its sustaining network of self-reinforcing processes and parts have given it a noticeable measure of autonomy. It may once have been as simple as an old computer program, merely parroting what we told it, but now it's more like a very complex organism that often follows its own urges. So we're building a complex technological organism. We can see that around us. This is what the internet is. You'll have seen the recent developments in artificial intelligence, I'm sure. Maybe you'll all be using them for your essays soon, hope not. But something very, very fast is happening, and we're creating a network of things which are designed to effectively manifest new life. We're trying to be gods. We're trying to build artificial intelligences. We're building robots. We're trying to create life. The old story manifesting in new form. I saw an interview recently with another transhumanist called Zoltan Istvan, glorious name for a transhumanist. Zoltan Istvan is another Silicon Valley guy, very quite influential there. And he has a picture of the future as a literal civil war between humans and AIs. I'll just read you what he says. While you're listening to this, have a think about the book of Genesis, and have a think about Cain, and think about eating the apple. Those humans who join AI and merge their brains directly with machines, says Zoltan, won't work, but will live in virtual worlds freely. Those humans that don't merge with AI will have companies whose primary goal is to keep AI out of the lives of the rest of the humans left on the planet. A conflict of who merges with AI and who doesn't is coming. It will likely be a civil war of sorts. Ultimately, people won't be able to stop progress, and most humans will upload themselves into new worlds where they don't die, don't have to work, or live as biological beings who suffer. If you're uploaded to a cloud, you won't have to earn a living. You'll give up some control of your life, and that will be some payment into this world to exist, but it will be a near perfect world of bliss and progress. Communication will only be through thoughts. Nothing else will exist for those that are uploaded into the cloud or live in quantum intelligence enclaves. There will be no eating, no breathing, no drinking, no using the bathroom. The flesh will be gone, paving the way for the exploration of how intelligent we can become. That is the final manifestation, the final destination of the story of progress. And it sounds like heaven, doesn't it? It sounds like a technological version of the Christian notion of heaven. Paradise after death. Think about that. You don't die, you don't have to work, you don't have to suffer. There's no flesh, ever expanding thoughts. A certain type of vision of heaven there is created by us. We're the gods now. We've created the heaven, not God. We don't believe in gods anymore. We're the gods now. We create our own heaven. We create our own beings. We merge with those beings. We live forever. We create a utopia, and we create eternity and immortality. It's a very old story. Very old story. People like Istvan are the ones creating the future. A lot of people in Silicon Valley who think like this. we're heading rapidly towards what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. The God-given nature of humans, if these people have their way, will rapidly be superseded and replaced, along with the rest of creation, by new designs which are more to the taste of modern people and their goals. And let me just give you a very small quote from another transhumanist, Martine Rothblatt, who, by the way, has created her own trans religion for transhumanists, but I won't go into that. But I'll tell you what she seeks to do in the development of AI and post-human technology. She says this: we are making God, as we are implementing technology that is ever more all-knowing, ever-present, all-powerful, and beneficent. Of course, geoethical nanotechnology will ultimately connect all consciousness and control the cosmos. Now, you remember what the little serpent said to us in the Garden of Eden? Do you remember what the devil said? You won't die by death. You can be like gods with the knowledge of good and evil. This is where it takes us. You can be like gods. Martine Rothblatt is making God, apparently. Making God, making ourselves creators. Not only are we creating new life, we're creating a God. Making our own creator, making our own creation. The point is, this time we're in charge. There are no limits now. We're going to make the world better than it was before. I had a conversation with Zoltan Istvan myself recently, actually, and he was very adamant that the world was going to be very much better when he'd redesigned it. He said the world is full of injustice. People die. There's all sorts of horrible things going on. We need to stop that. And we're going to stop it with technology. So this is very utopian, this vision. Very utopian. These people really think they're going to save the world. So Christianity, as I said, much to my surprise, this story that I thought was old and irrelevant, turns out to tell us exactly what is going on, because it was going on when the book of Genesis was written 3,000 years or so ago. And apparently has been going on since the beginning of time. It's a prideful rebellion against life. This is the source of the environmental crisis. It's not the wrong fuels, not the wrong technologies or the wrong politicians or the wrong agreements. It's this desire to be like gods. It's this story that we call progress, but actually is a very, very, very old story of us wanting to rebel against God, against life, against nature. And it gives us two choices. We see very, very clearly from this, to my mind, that we have two choices about how to live. So one is the way that Jesus of Nazareth shows us how to live. Humility. Blessed are the meek. Humility, humus, remember. In Adam, in the garden, in communion. Loving your neighbor, loving your enemy. That's the way of carrying the cross, I suppose. And the other way is the continued rebellion against creator and creation in the world that Cain built. So as I say, if you put that in the context of the New Testament, you see a development of the story, because now the story is that God manifests in human form to give you a path back to the garden if you want to take it. It's a narrow path and you have to carry a cross up it, but you can go it. You can go up it if you want to. And the path involves meekness, love of neighbor and enemy, love of God, refusal of violence and judgment, voluntary poverty, sharing of possessions, all humility again. It's very hard. Most of us don't want to do it. I certainly don't. And yet I do. Because the alternative is the continued rebellion. So, much to my own surprise, I found that the teachings that we seem to have been given in the New Testament, at great cost, all these teachings here, if we'd followed them, we wouldn't be here. Because it would be impossible for somebody actually following what Jesus and the early Christians called the way. It was what they called Christianity. It was never called Christianity for quite some centuries. It was the way. If you'd followed the way, we couldn't be here now. We wouldn't have been able to create these technologies. We wouldn't have an economy fueled by greed. We wouldn't be felling the forests and poisoning the ocean. It wouldn't be possible for somebody actually living in the kind of way that Christ told them to live, to do this. No empire can be built by anyone who's following those teachings properly. There'd be no ecological crisis. So we haven't followed them plainly. And plenty of Christians haven't followed them either. And I'm certainly not putting myself on a pedestal as someone who does very well, but at least we know what they are. So then the question becomes, well, has anyone ever done this? How could you do it? How could you live it? What would it mean? And for me, the work I've been doing very recently, which excites me most, is looking at the lives of some of the Christian saints and their relationships with creation, with nature. Now, here's something interesting. The word holy comes from an Old English word, hullig. It's an old Anglo-Saxon word, and it means whole. Literally, it means to be whole. To be holy is to be whole. So if you're whole again, the way you were built in the Garden of Eden before everything fragmented and you fell into your rebellion, then you're back in communion with everything else. And isn't it interesting? It certainly is to me how so many of the lives of the saints, especially the early saints of Britain and Ireland, which are the saints that interest me because it's where I come from, but there are other examples all over the world. The more holy, whole these saints become, the more they seem to get back into communion with the natural world. There are fascinating stories. So, for example, St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, a great saint of the north of England, he lived in a sandstone cave on the mainland, and then he retreated to a tiny island off the English coast in the North Sea. This is, I think, in the 8th century. It's very early. And he built there a small chapel and a hermitage, and he would go into the sea and he would pray. He would stand for hours in the sea praying, and then he would come out of the sea and the sea otters would lick him dry, they tell us. And as he became holier, remember, Hallig, as he became more whole, the wild companions appeared. So the sea otters would dry his feet. The eagles would bring him fish. There's an incredible story that runs all the way through the stories of the Christian saints. They're always being fed by birds. They're starving in the desert. The birds bring them food. The eider ducks that Cuthbert used to look after are still there on the Isle of Lindisfarne. They call them cuddy ducks now. They're named after Cuthbert. All these stories about St. Cuthbert and many others in communion with the creatures around him, and they don't seem to be afraid of the holy people. And we have so many stories like this: St. Francis of Assisi, St. Paul of Thebes, St. Benedict, St. Theodora of Romania, all sorts of others fed by birds, all of them fed by birds when they're hungry. So many of the desert fathers were fed by birds. St. Paul of Thebes, he was in the desert, he died in the desert. He was on his own, old man, died in the desert. St. Anthony was with him. But St. Anthony was an old man too, and he was wondering how he could bury this dead saint. He's just standing there in the desert with a dead saint thinking, how can I bury him? I'm too old and weak. These two lions appear. They dig the hole, and St. Paul is buried. We don't know how many of these stories are mythical, how many of them reflect truth, but I'd say a good deal of them do, because we have more modern stories. For example, St. Seraphim of Sarov, wonderful Roman saint, famously befriended a bear when he lived in the forests in Russia. My favorite story is the story of St. Coleman MacDhu, who's an old Irish saint who lives very near where I live. He lived in a cave for 7 years in the Burren, which is not far from my house. And St. Cuthbert was said to have, St. Coleman was said to have had these 3 animal companions. He had a cockerel and a mouse and a fly. The cockerel was supposed to crow in the morning to wake him up. The mouse was supposed to bite him if he didn't get out of bed after being woken up by the cockerel. And the fly was supposed to walk along the lines of his Bible as he read it. And eventually these animals died, as animals would do. And Coleman was very sad about this. And he wrote to his friend, another one of the well-known Irish saints, and he wrote to him out of his sadness. And the saint wrote back and said, the reason that you are sad is that you were too rich when you had these friends. Be rich no more, he said. Be rich no more. That's the spirit of the Desert Fathers. But the point here, all of these stories about the saints in the wilderness tell us that the saints achieve such a level of what the Orthodox Christians call theosis, which is union with God, that they approach the Edenic state again. They go back to, they are able to live in communion with nature. It can be done. And I think it can be done by us, not by becoming saints, which few of us are very likely to do, but by seeking to become holy, which means to become whole, to stop rebelling, to stop attempting to be gods, and to stop telling the story of the society that does that. So sometimes when I'm asked, well, in fact, I'm often asked this now, what should the Christian response to the environmental crisis be? And people assume that because I'm a Christian now and I used to be an activist, I would be able to answer that question. And of course, I can't answer that question. And there are a lot of answers to it. But really, if I had to give an answer to it, my answer would be a simple one, and it's that we should just try to live like Christians. The Christian response to the environmental crisis is to be a Christian. Because if we actually lived the way we were supposed to live, it would be, as I said, impossible for us to be here. So that's where I am, and that's the story I've found and the story I've told. I'm sure it's a story that will keep going. But that's all I've got to say. So thank you for listening. It's always strange speaking into a disembodied computer when you can't see anybody, but there seem to be a lot of you out there. Be really happy to take any questions from anybody at all, but thanks for listening.
You're missing the deafening applause that would follow your really
well, exactly, yes. Hopefully I can pretend there would be deafening applause as opposed to some horrified
and
silence.
I can tell you that teaching during the pandemic to black boxes was no fun.
I can imagine.
So I can deeply sympathize. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your thoughts. And as people are gathering their own thoughts and what they'd like to ask you, just a reminder, everyone, that you can go to the Q&A feature and at the bottom of your Zoom screen and post questions for possible consideration. So feel free to do that. I myself, as one of our moderators here, I'm going to take the liberty to maybe start us off. I'm tempted to read a passage from Confessions, I wish I might do in a minute, but actually, to maybe start us off, I was hoping to share 2 bits from Pope Francis to get your reaction. It sounds very similar to what you're saying. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say whether you agree or not. So, Pope Francis wrote this letter in 2015 on care for our common home, and says something very similar to what I heard you saying, right, about this redefining a notion of progress. So rejecting what he calls the technocratic paradigm and its definition of progress, and replacing it with this idea, in part, of trying to not just change our light bulbs, but ourselves, so to speak. Would you see that as sort of similar to the direction you're going, or if you would draw distinctions with your own thought and his, what might they be?
Sorry, I missed a part of your question there because of my dodgy internet connection, but I think I've got the gist of it. Yeah, very interesting. I actually hadn't seen that writing before. It's quite intriguing, isn't it? There's the Pope saying the same thing as me. So that's maybe I'm on the right track. Yeah, I've got the Laudato Si pamphlet on my shelf that the Pope put out a year ago, and a while ago. I remember reading that when it came out. And I wasn't even a Christian at the time, and I read it and I thought, wow, this is kind of this is deep ecology. I didn't expect this from the Pope. So yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about this in the churches. Of course there is, and there has been for a long time. And I think people are hopefully, and I see examples of this, people are getting beyond the more kind of shallow analysis of how we have to stop climate change by doing X, Y, and Z, and starting to ask the big question about the deep story that's got us here. And clearly the Pope's doing that. So yeah, it's exciting. I suppose it depends how much impact that's having, but who knows? What else can he do? I think he's pretty sharp on these things, actually.
Excellent. All right, that's a good start. Joshua, do you have anything before we turn to the Q&A?
I'll let other people go first, because I think once I start talking to Paul, then I won't stop. So
yeah, I hear that. So let's start with a question from Jonas Hawk, who says the machine has a role for technology. Is the corresponding power magic in the way? Does Hermeticism provide an option for incorporating magic with the way?
Well, I would say not, because I'm somebody who came out of Wicca, and used to practice a bit of magic myself, and Hermeticism is interesting in that sense, I suppose. But I mean, I think Christianity is pretty clear about the reason that you don't perform magic, and it's because, again, there's a potential for you trying to be gods, and you don't know what you're going to get into. So I used to be very into my tarot cards, and I used to be very into the Hermeticism and all the other things I did, and I've put them all aside now, and I'm quite glad I have, because I think that the Christian path is the path of surrender. Once you actually surrender yourself to something much bigger than you, which is the very thing that we're not supposed to want to do, because that's supposed to be slavery rather than freedom. It turns out that it's freedom. So for me, the reason I became Orthodox is I wanted to well, there's a number of reasons. Some are a bit more mystical than others, but one of the reasons is I wanted to join the oldest church. I wanted to join a church that could give me a serious path that I could follow, and I didn't have to work it out myself. We spend a lot of time in the modern world, in the modern West, sort of working out our own spirituality. I did that for a long time, and it's very exhausting, and most of it's not right. And it's a relief when you find a path and you think, actually, this is a thing I can follow because I think it's true, and then things start to happen. So for me, the path is, as I say, follow the path, surrender, and then you'll be surprised what starts happening.
We've got a question from one of our colleagues, Mary Evelyn Tucker from Yale, who says, warm greetings, Paul. And can you say a word about the Christian thinkers Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry, who came to visions of spirit and matter as integral?
Yeah, definitely. And hello, Mary. Mary actually came to my house many years ago, and we were and I haven't seen her since then. So now I'm seeing her in the disembodied box. So hello, I'm glad you've come, Mary. Yeah, and Mary has done great work on Thomas Berry, actually, and I think it might even have been Mary who introduced me to him. And I think I don't know much about Teilhard de Chardin at all, so I can't say anything about him, although people keep telling me to read him. But yeah, Thomas Berry, I think, is a very important thinker, and I think anyone who's interested in anything I've just said should be reading Thomas Berry, actually, because he was talking about this a long time ago. It's been a long time since I read him properly, so I can't say much in detail, and certainly not as much as Mary could say anyway. But yeah, I mean, he's a good example of a serious Christian thinker who was really engaged with these issues at a very deep level long before they became fashionable. So that's yeah, and I would definitely engage with him. In fact, I should probably read him again myself.
Dr. Tucker, if you had a follow-up, I made it so that you could unmute yourself if you'd like.
Thank you.
Russ?
Thank you so much. I'm here with John and Paul. It's wonderful to see you, and we so enjoyed our visit with you. I think we're just suggesting these, of course, are very brilliant thinkers who were not only integral and I think foundational for an ecological sensibility that we're seeking, but I think there's many others, and I love that you're relying on the early Christian saints and so on. But the Christianity and ecology movement is now quite robust, and I'm so glad that Brian mentioned Laudato Si, which is, I think, one of the greatest critiques of modern capitalism, as well as a sense that people and planet, eco-justice all have to come together. So I think we're thrilled, and I'd love John just to say we're delighted to hear your talk. We're so interested in your work, and there's lots more to flow through your articulate voice and help this to grow. So thank you.
Yeah, we definitely want to thank the Center for Climate, Society, Environment for inviting Paul. And Paul, we intentionally came from out of a beautiful sunny day to come and sit inside, listen to you. Because
Well, I hope it was worth it.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
we take you seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that's another part of, I feel, in your very welcome emphasis on humility, is your emphasis of person on seriousness. Gravity, I think, gravitas is a Western mode of processing through the world. And we have turned it, as you point out so well, towards this arrogance of affirming ourselves. But that gravitas, that seriousness, is something, when we turn it towards humility, as you're suggesting, I think it will redound to our upbringing again in our truly humanist manner. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Brian, I see Kevin O'Brien in the chat too, and I think Kevin and others are working in an imperfect way, we all are, but in what it means to retrieve, to reevaluate, and reconstruct these traditions in ways that are going to have relevance in modernity, where religion is not always embraced. So, I don't know, Kevin may have some more to say, but anyway, we could go on forever.
Thank you so much.
Paul. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you both. Nice to hear from you both.
Yeah, we'll continue the conversation.
See you in Ireland.
Yeah, I hope so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary and John. Appreciate it. Well, you both suggested we turn to Kevin O'Brien, and so let's go ahead and do that next. And Kevin, I have made it possible for you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question. Feel free, or I can read it for you. I'll go ahead and read it. So Kevin says, do you think the Christian tradition has resources to correct itself, to adapt its stories? For example, if we're not comfortable with the implications of the Genesis story for ideas about gender, can it be adjusted, or must we accept it as it is?
Well, I don't think we can change the foundational stories. No, I mean, you can't change the foundational stories of a tradition. How you read them is another matter. I mean, we could have a conversation about that. There's a lot of different ways to read the book of Genesis, for example, which I probably can't go into here, and I'm hardly a theologian. But no, I mean, I think the foundational stories of a faith are either true or they're not true. There are things you can fiddle with in the Christian tradition at the level of, you know, how it's practiced in the world and continuing to make it relevant because it has to move through the times. But the foundational stories are the foundational stories. And I think that, you know, if the story of Christianity is true, and if the story doesn't fit with the times we're in, then it's the times we're in that have got the problem. I mean, that's the way it seems to me. I mean, the story is either true or it isn't. I also think that there's obviously different ways to read different books of the Bible. When you read the New Testament, you know, when you're reading the stories of what Christ does, you're almost, I think, reading eyewitness stories. When you're reading the book of Genesis, you're not. You're reading a myth. You're reading a story about creation, which is not supposed to be taken as kind of literal truth. So there are different ways to tell them. There are always different ways to tell the stories, but I think that obviously the foundational stories have to remain the same. But we don't tell them the way that we told them in the 10th century, you know, because we're different people and we have a different audience. But we have to remain faithful to the teaching if we think it's true. Otherwise, we shouldn't be here. That's how it seems to me.
I know that Dr. Schultz has to head off to class, and I'm sure others are going to be trickling away to class too. Joshua, did you have anything you wanted to share before you had to head to class? We can continue to the conversation as long as Paul's available, but.
Yeah, if I get one, I guess, Paul, you talked about tubal cane as sort of an example of a suboptimal example of power of creation. And so my question for you would be thinking along the lines of like Tolkien and a proper sense of subcreation, what that looks like for you, you know, be it as a writer or just as, you know, someone going through this life. Have you thought about that?
Sorry, what have I thought about subcreation?
Well, I guess the idea would be you gave a negative example. So when I think of a positive example, I think of Tolkien. Do you have other positive examples?
Yeah, it's a good example. It's a good example, isn't it? I mean, I wrote an essay today about I wrote an essay this week actually on my Substack about this, well, not about exactly that, but about something that touches on this, which is about the question of what technology serves. You could have a long conversation about what technology is, but the question would be what technology serves. What tools or technologies can you create that can serve you, and what are you trying to serve with it? So if you look at the two paths of human arrogance versus humility, you could potentially have, you know, technologies that serve the humble path, and you can have technologies that serve the path of human arrogance. And I suppose the most obvious example that people talk about is, say, that in theory, the Amish. I don't know a great deal about the Amish, but I do know that in theory, Amish communities will only adopt technologies that serve the community, right? So the community is a Christian community. They have a particular form they want their community to take, and they will only take in technologies that serve it and don't damage it, which is a very wise approach. And people like, for example, Wendell Berry, who's a great influence on me, write about this at great length as well. And so do a lot of other thinkers from a Christian and other backgrounds. So it is possible to create in a way that serves life, and it's possible to create in a way that destroys life. So are you creating something that serves, say, the moral economy and the web of life, or are you creating something that destroys it? Those are the questions, but we don't ask those questions when we create technologies, because our technologies are designed to serve the story of progress, which is the story of our busting of limits, which is how we've got to the point where we think we can create God. So it seems to me that it would be possible to, in theory, at least, maybe not on a societal level, but certainly at a small scale, to do the kind of thing that the Amish do and say, we're going to adopt technologies which serve a particular spiritual and cultural and ecological purpose and reject ones that don't. Now, of course, in order to do that, you have to then overcome our desire for money, wealth, power, and all the other things that humans like. So it's not easy, but in theory, yeah, of course. And as you say, in terms of creation, think of a beautiful icon, think of a painting, think of a piece of music. I mean, a piece of music can also serve life and create beauty, or it could be horrible and terrible. So any number of possibilities. I think the question is, what are you serving with what you make?
I would like to connect that to the theme of the Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, I know which is a bit ago in your thinking, but I know we've got a lot of environmental studies students on this call, and students who are interested in dedicating a good portion of their life to trying to be useful to understanding and responding to the challenges that they've been born into. So I'm reading from your essay on called Withdrawal. You write, we are environmentalists now in order to promote something called sustainability. What does this curious plastic word mean? It does not mean defending the non-human world from ever-expanding empire of Homo sapiens, though some of its adherents like to pretend it does, even to themselves. It means sustaining human civilization at the comfort level of the world's rich people, us, feel is their right without destroying the, quote, natural capital or the, quote, resource base that is needed to do so. It is, in other words, an entirely human-centered piece of politicking disguised as concern for the planet. The success of environmentalism has been total at the price of its soul. You go on to draw a distinction between action and activism, and I'm not sure if you are still using that distinction to frame your thought or not, but I wanted to tee you up an opportunity to sort of speak to that part of your thinking if you're interested.
Yeah, I was right. That's obviously an essay. Gosh, that's an essay I wrote 13 years ago, I think now. So I'm long recovered now. But but yeah, the difference between action and activism really interested me at the time because I still had a kind of self-identity as an activist. And that's in this culture, that's what we think you must immediately do if you want to change something, to be this thing called an activist. You go out there in the world and there are sort of tried and tested ways to do things. And yeah, sometimes that's useful, sometimes it's necessary, but sometimes it's just kind of performative. And sometimes it's not as useful as action. Gardening is action, building is action, painting is action, writing is action, bringing up a family is action. None of that's activism, but it's action in the world. And I tend to think these days that action is a lot more useful than a kind of self-identified political form of activism, which just kind of increasingly just sort of feeds the culture war and doesn't change very much on any side of the debate. So yeah, that's the way I see it, and I think sustainability when I was a young activist was a radical concept, and now it's just a sort of corporate buzzword that means absolutely nothing and is absolutely everywhere.
Is part of your concern that environmentalists, corporate environmentalists, I'm not sure if you'd use that phrase or not, are in service of the notions of progress that you're worried about? They're now just sort of trying to work in service of making that notion of progress sustainable. Is that another way of putting your...
Yeah, entirely so. I think environmentalism, when it started off, was a radical creed which challenged the notion of progress and wanted different stories. And mainstream environmentalism now is not. It's simply an attempt to make the machine greener, to make the story of progress greener, to change the fuel sources. And we see all sorts of things proposed by environmentalists today, from vat-grown food to GM crops to nuclear power to the industrialization of mountains in the name of fuel, which are hugely destructive of nature and our relationship with it. But they seem to have lost the plot because they're so obsessed with making modernity sustainable that they've lost track of how a human should actually live with the rest of life. And I think, again, you could see that as saying, look, radical environmentalism used to be in service of a smaller life, a human scale life, a humbler, meeker life, and now it's in service of the dominant culture, of the machine culture, which I think is a mistake. But I think it was also inevitable as well. Environmentalism's kind of been co-opted, and a lot of very well-meaning people want to change things. They want to make corporations sustainable and change the fuels we use, and that's, those are not bad things to do. They're not bad things to do at all, but they don't shift the direction of things. I don't know whether we can shift the direction of things, really. I think we're probably going to go where we go. But if we don't question the story, we're not going to be able to come up with a better one.
In the spirit of your comment about early radical environmentalism, maybe pull up a question from Scott Manicky, if I'm pronouncing your name right, Scott. He asks, how do we walk a path of humility back to the garden without stumbling into misanthropy? Which is something, Gary, I think of Gary Snyder, whom you like to reference, as, sort of famously seen as veering into misanthropy at times. So thoughts on how to avoid that, if indeed you do want to avoid
Yeah,
it?
well, no, you do. I mean, interestingly to me, it's Christianity that saved me from veering into misanthropy. I mean, it's certainly very easy to become misanthropic when you look at how enormously destructive humans are being to the rest of nature, or indeed just look at so much of the brutality of human history. It's quite easy to become misanthropic, and some environmentalists do. And I certainly had my days when I was an activist. I mean, I think actually, if you're a Christian, it's impossible to be a misanthropist. You know, we're supposed to love our enemies. We have to love our neighbors. We have to see every other human being as a child of God. So, you know, we might want to feel misanthropic sometimes, but actually we're mandated not to. So to me, the Christian path is a path that rescues you from misanthropy. I mean, the Buddhist path should be as well, actually, interestingly, because Gary Snyder is a Buddhist. And I've been an admirer of his writing. So, you know, I found him very valuable. I don't know much about what he's up to at the moment, but yeah, as I say, I mean, if you are again following the teachings of the way, it shouldn't be possible for you to be a misanthropist. And if you find yourself in that place, you should be able to correct yourself, you know.
To connect that to one more from Josephine Wright, I'm guessing you would say something very similar, but you tell me. She asks, I would like to hear you speak of eco-despair and avenues to hope. Climate activism is one, living the values the way. I'm moving into an eco-responsible co-housing community. And so would you say something similar in terms of what led you to your work in the way as a response to not only avoiding misanthropy, but also ecological anxiety and despair?
Yeah, I think, again, you know, I went through a lot of that, been through a lot of that as an activist, as all people have who are paying attention. And it's much worse, it's much harder, I think, for young people now than it was when I was young, because this stuff is coming through your smartphone every 5 minutes. So you're kind of growing up in a stew of anxiety. I think hope is important. It depends what you're hoping for, of course. The hope has to not be false hope. What I found as an activist is that if you have a kind of false hope in what's possible, for example, stopping the climate from changing or creating universal justice or something you'd like to see, but you don't have the power to see, then you can fall into despair quite easily, because false hope is worse than no hope in a way. So if you keep your hope small, keep your hope sustainable, then then it's very easy to live more fully. And I think, for example, things like moving into a community with other people and doing practical work on the ground. I mean, I have a piece of land and I do a lot of gardening and work outside, and that's the kind of thing that saves you from kind of going crazy in your head about the state of the world, because the world is still there and it's still full of people, and there's lots of good things you can do. And the more you go out and get engaged, and the more you get off social media, get off the internet with all of the horror that's on there, then the more chance of hope there is. And of course, if you're a Christian, you know, the story is ultimately hopeful. You have to go through a lot before you get there, but there's a hopeful end.
I think that's a lovely place to end. What a wonderful conversation. You know, again, we don't have a large room of people to be able to shower you with applause, but that we're all doing so. Everyone can be clapping at home and thank Paul for sharing his thoughts today. We really do appreciate it. I wanted to just remind everybody that we have a couple of more events that are coming up this semester that we'd hope that you'd consider registering for. This event today, like most of our talks, are recorded. And so it will be available hopefully as early as tomorrow and posted on our YouTube channel. So you can go to YouTube and look for the Climate Center's YouTube channel and subscribe to it so that you're notified of future events. Also, again, if you have the means to support our work, we really appreciate it. This lecture series is a great opportunity for people not only in our community, but around the world to learn about different aspects of the climate crisis, understanding the nature of the problem in a full-bodied way so that we can actually pursue something that genuinely would be something closer to and akin to a solution. And so thank you again, Paul. I don't think you would necessarily have any reason to know it, but it's amazing to the degree to which your comments flow with and connect to different speakers we've had over the last 18 months or so. And so Mary Evelyn Tucker here, and John Grimm and others are good examples of that. She was part of our speaker series last year. John Cobb, Herman Daly, lots of other interesting folks. So anyway, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you could join us today from Ireland.
Yeah, thank you as well. Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Take care.